Today I prepared for you a blitz game played between the 8th world champion, Mikhail Tal, and Anatoly Karpov, the 12th world champion. A true clash of two champions, with the sacrifice of two rooks. The game was played in 1987. Mikhail Tal begins the game with e4, seizing the center. c6 replies Anatoly Karpov, preparing later to strike in the center with d5. c4 from Mikhail Tal. On the board is the Caro-Kann defense. The idea of white is that now after d5, as indeed followed in the game, Karpov strikes at the center with d5. White captures, and after the recapture follows the exchange of 4 pawns. After black removes the white pawn on d5, white will have an isolated pawn on the d-file, but in return gains a central pawn and free piece play. Karpov develops his king's knight to f6, and wants to take on d5 specifically with the knight, since on a queen capture, white could, with tempo, develop the knight to c3. Tal develops his knight to c3, and after the capture on d5, develops the king's knight to f3, allowing black, if he wishes, to take on c3. The 12th world champion, knowing firsthand the sharp attacking style of Mikhail Tal, decides to exchange one pair of knights. Capture on c3, recapture with the pawn on c3. Yes, white of course obtains the pawn center after d4, but with one pair of knights less. g6. Black fianchettos the dark-squared bishop on the long dark diagonal. d4. White seizes the center. Now he can develop the light-squared bishop and castle. Black develops the bishop to g7. And after bishop d3, black completes the development of the king side by castling, hiding the king in a safe place. For the moment safe, white, without wasting much time, also castles. The black knight comes out to c6. White has his pawn center, and the black bishop on g7 shoots well across the position. The white pawns are always under its sight. Tal brings the rook to the e-file. Rook e1, rook e8 from black. Next move, black already intends to break with e5, undermining white's central structure. Tal, developing his last minor piece, plays bishop g5 and pins black's pawn on e7 to the queen on d8. Now, e5 is not so simple to play. Black needs to solve the problem of the bishop on c8. On the long white diagonal, it cannot come, since too much time is required for b6 and then bishop b7. And in this position, Karpov decides to put his bishop on e6. Also, of course, it would have been logical to play bishop g4, pinning white's knight on f3, and later, for example after a queen move, preparing e5, using the fact that the white knight is pinned. But in the game, Karpov chooses bishop e6. The idea of this move is that next move he can put his bishop on the long white diagonal. Apparently, Karpov simply forgot that opposite him sits Mikhail Tal. Rook takes e6, black recaptures, but now without the light-squared bishop, white receives the advantage of the two bishops, and especially the strongest light-squared bishop, which now cannot easily be challenged. White's bishop comes to c4, already threatening to take the pawn on e6, and black is forced to defend. Queen d6, centralizing the queen, also watching over the pawn on e6. Queen e2. White continues to increase pressure along the e-file on the pawn e6. The black knight goes backward to d8, defending the pawn on e6, but rook e1. And defenders of the pawn on e6 for black are not enough. To move the king to f7 is not desirable at all. Black brings the last inactive piece, the rook, from a8 to c8. The rook begins to play along the c-file, looking at the bishop and the pawn on c3. And in this position for white, the main thing is to remember his strategic goal. Having sacrificed the rook on e6 for the bishop, white obtained a terrible initiative together with the light-squared bishop. Therefore, simply giving away that bishop on e6, taking the pawn on e6, is unprofitable. After capturing on e6 and numerous exchanges would follow, capture on c3. And what remains here for white? White simply remains down the exchange. He has a knight for black's rook. The position is losing. Therefore, of course, the strategic idea here of Mikhail Nikimovich Tal is precisely to attack the black king. And best of all, to do this with knight d2. Tal transfers the knight into the center to e4, also supporting his bishop on c4. Black responds with king h8, stepping out of all x-rays from the bishop towards the pawn on e6. The knight comes to e4, attacking the queen. The black queen retreats, also threatening to take the bishop on c4. The bishop steps back to b3, and black tries to untangle in this position. He strikes in the center with e5, trying to break apart white's pawn structure in the center. And again, for white, the main thing in this position is not to play for material, not to try to defend the pawn on d4, which black threatens to take twice and win. White must continue to follow his plan, which Tal does. He plays h4, trying to break open black's cocoon on the king side. Black eats the pawn on d4, but h5 follows. The white pawn march continues towards the black king, and in this position, Karpov starts to crumble. He takes with the pawn on h5. Well, better of course in this position was, for example, queen b6, thereby connecting the queen to defense. Now on capture, simply recapture with the queen, and the queen here would excellently defend the black king, but instead follows capture on h5. Already, Tal also makes a slight inaccuracy, but plays in human style. He takes with the queen on h5. The best, of course, in this position would have been a rather inhuman move, knight f6. In blitz, at least, such a move is very hard to find. The point is that this knight cannot be taken. For example, on capture of the knight on f6, white takes with the bishop with check. Black is forced to take this bishop, otherwise mate follows. But then white captures the rook, the undefended rook on e8. But if capturing with the pawn, then all the same. First white eats the rook, and then immediately mates the black king. On blocking with the bishop after the capture, white eats this bishop, and it is mate to the black king. But if this knight is not taken after knight f6, something must be done. For white is attacking the black rook on e8, and on the retreat of the rook follows yet another sacrifice. The knight captures on f7, sacrificing itself, and completely destroying black's defenses on the king side. After the knight is taken, there follows a beautiful mate. The queen captures on h5, the only interposition, and here is mate to the black king. In this way, the game could have ended already here, but Mikhail Tal plays in a more human way. He captures with the queen on h5, attacking the rook on e8. The rook is forced to retreat, rook f8, connecting the rook along the f-file to the king's defense. But now comes bishop c2. The white bishop will play a more active attacking role. Threats of discovered knight jumps begin to appear, for example also on f6, with mating threats from the queen supported by the bishop. Black must defend with queen e5, centralizing the queen and tying down the white pieces. Now the bishop cannot move, since behind it hangs the queen on h5, and the knight also, since behind it hangs the rook on e1 with check. But nothing terrible, thinks Mikhail Tal. He plays knight g3. The second white rook is sacrificed, this time a pure rook. In this way, white tries to distract the black queen from defending its king, and it is not as if black has any choice. The queen has nowhere to retreat while staying close to the king side. The entire point of knight g3 is that white opens his light-squared bishop, and already now threatens mate in one move. Queen takes h7. Therefore, it is necessary to capture this rook with check. The white king is forced to retreat, and black's checks run out. Still, there is the threat of mate in one, queen h7. In this position, black had only one saving move: to find the inhuman resource bishop h6, giving white some material, sacrificing his bishop. But whichever way white captures here, if for example taking with the bishop, then follows rook f7. The rook is defended by the knight from d8. Thus, the rook along the 7th rank protects its king. The pawn on g7 is defended. But if, for example, to capture this bishop with the queen, then also rook f7, protecting the pawn on h7. White here simply lacks material, and the whole attack breaks down. But in the game, this did not happen. The move was not found. Black played h6, in human style, trying to block the mate. But now follows bishop takes h6. The black king is forced to run, since if taking, then comes, again, mate in a couple of moves. And now, after king g8, white captures the bishop on g7. Black captures on f2, trying to counterattack, attacking the bishop on c2. But white's mate is stronger. White gives check with the queen on h7. The only retreat for the king is f7 and queen g6. King g8, bishop a6 check. Next move, after the only retreat of the black king to h8, will follow mate with the queen on g7. With such a stunning attack, the 8th world champion Mikhail Tal defeated the 12th world champion Anatoly Karpov. Put a like if you enjoyed this game, and do not forget to support the channel. All the links are in the description. Thank you for watching.